In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lane, author of Bash Revolution, online contrarian, CEO, head honcho, boss man of Sublation Media.
And I'm Ashley Frawley. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent, second honcho of Sublation Media, and lots of other wonderful affiliations. I'm also a mom, and I say this because my kids were sick a couple of days ago, and I think I caught what they had. I was feeling really bad last night, and then I was like, oh, it passed, and then just now it hit me again. So I apologize if I'm a little bit low energy today, and I think I'll be okay, and I'll turn off my camera if the worst happens.
I should say I'm 53 years old, so I apologize for being low energy all the time. But if Ashley has assured me that if she needs to vomit, she will turn off the camera. And with that, let us begin. We're going to be starting by talking about a YouTuber named, what was her name again? Oh, I have her right here, but I forgot her name. Do you remember, Ashley?
Oh my goodness, I'm terrible.
Very popular YouTuber.
History student.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at her face briefly.
Okay, I will put her on the screen for a second.
We are taught about history as a story of humanity's progression through time. With this framework...
So that's who I'm going to run that whole clip, but yeah, gosh, I have her. You know what? I'm going to just find right now what her name is. It is Mika LaFay. Or Mika LaFay. There you go. It's not, how hard is that to say? And she is doing very well on YouTube. Well worth watching. This is a reaction video to her at the start, at least. And why don't I go ahead and just run that clip to start with, because we're going to be talking about universities.
The capitalist university.
Yeah, the capitalist university, and the power of youth movements and youthful protests, and some of the downsides to that approach to politics. So here is a clip with Mika LaFay. I should have written that down at the top. Here we
are taught about history as a story of humanity's progression through time. With this framework, radical change is discouraged because we are taught that time will heal, and eventually history will absolve the problems of society through the liberal democratic process. But this is simply not the case, and is deeply ahistorical. We got the 8-hour workday largely in part of the Haymarket riots. We got affordable school lunches because of the food programs of the militant Black Panther Party. We are taught that humans learn from our past mistakes and that we're continually seeking to progress ourselves. Yet we are currently witnessing a genocide unfold before our very eyes, and we are seeing media outlets hardly covering it at all. One of the reasons why American society hates the humanities is because the government fears a conscious people who can critically analyze the nation-state and its functions. Now, I don't think this is some grand conspiracy to demonize the humanities. It's simply a product of our oppressive state. It's a product of our market-oriented society. I mean, if you think about it, would the state incentivize someone to take classes that challenge their legitimacy, that challenge their hegemony?
All right, so that's just a short clip from Mika LaFay's video, which is entitled "The Death of the Humanities: Education in the Capitalist University." And I wanted to start by just running a fact check here. She claims that the school lunch programs were the result of the Black Panther Party's activism, but the National School Lunch Program began in 1946. It was a security measure enacted to protect the public from failures endemic to society itself. That is, it was a response to the Great Depression, some of the crises that had begun within civil society, as I wrote it down here. It was a way to try to combat the depression and privation, which was the unintended consequence of how civil society was organized, and which the state had to step in and try to solve, administrate and solve the problem. What the Black Panthers did do was provide breakfast to impoverished children in Oakland, California. Kids who had breakfast as well as lunch performed better in school. This was perceived as a threat by J. Edgar Hoover, not because the kids were getting breakfast, but because it was rehabilitating the reputation of militant Black nationalists. The FBI smashed the breakfast program and the Black Panthers, but the federal government noticed the value in their idea, and the state took over the effort. In the mid to in the mid 70s, what had started as a direct action by a radical civil society organization was smashed and absorbed by the very state that the Black Panthers were attempting to challenge. I have a lot more I could say here, but did you want to run a fact check on
Yes.
Mickey
So
LaFay?
one thing that I found very interesting, and I see this a lot with video essays and maybe like commentary. I saw this a lot in Bulent Somai's book. I love talking about Bulent Somai's book. It's called Beyond Family, out from Sublation Press. And
Mhm.
I encourage, even though I disagree profoundly with this book, I very much encourage people to read it. So I think you should read how the stories that people put together in the world that you completely disagree with, this sort of world building that they have. But I found him constantly being like, we are taught blah, blah, blah. We assume that this and this happens. Like, he even at one point says something like, it's still socially acceptable to say, come on, Tommy, show your willy to the neighbors. And I was like, I don't know what neighborhood you live in, Bulent, but that is not socially acceptable remotely. Anyway, but this idea, like, we are taught that history will heal all wounds, essentially. I thought to myself, who is still taught that? I mean,
Yeah.
she's quite youthful, so maybe she's thinking of like her own experience in schools and perhaps like, school before university. Maybe in America, you are kind of given a Whiggish history, that the history sort of is progressive, but that is so now when people say that, I think they're being consciously iconoclastic. I think they're being consciously subversive to forward the idea that history is progressive. Now it is absolutely standard to teach history is not progressive. There are all sorts of contingencies. And the worst can happen. And when we kind of put forward, sometimes as a corrective for, Marxists and communists and socialists or whatever, to kind of point out, hey, like, actually, capitalism does have a progressive edge to it. It's not all, immiseration and so on. There's relative immiseration and all that, of course, and we want to prevent the worst from happening. But we should also be real about the fact that capitalism does lift people out of poverty, has done. It has a productive side that's extremely powerful and it's been good for humanity. It also has an extraordinarily destructive side that is very powerful and very bad for humanity. But we kind of have to emphasize that as a profound corrective to an overly dismal view of history as an engine of regress. So I found that very interesting, that this view that, like, I am kind of telling you people, the masses, you're wrong. History is actually not, it isn't progressive. I don't know, but perhaps the American experience is different.
No, I think what it is that rather than being taught that history will heal all wounds and that there's a progressive dynamic to history, we are taught that we are taught this, but that it isn't true.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah,
That is what you
absolutely.
learn in humanities. Like, there is this myth, but it is not true. That is what I think what you're taught. And I want to go on to another point. She says that the media is not covering the genocide in Gaza. I think this is a subjective claim, so it's difficult to refute. But I do think it's true that the story of the conflict and the ethnic cleansing and the bombing and the murders and the massacres and the starvation and the humanitarian crisis and the genocide in Gaza has been dominating the headlines since October 7th. But maybe what she means to say is that the story is not being covered in a way that encourages citizens to really take action. And I wouldn't really disagree with that. But I think it's wrong to say that the media is ignoring this story, which is a stronger claim than maybe what she made.
Yeah. So my normie litmus test, as we all know, is talking to my husband, who has barely a high school education, but is a smart guy and a caring individual, very traditional kind of fellow, but also a communist, because on a Greek island, a worker is a communist. That's kind of the way it is. Not because, as I like to joke, you have blue hair and enjoy polyamory. So he's kind of like an old school communist. And I was talking to him about, like, I said to him, like, what do you know about what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening with Israel and Gaza? And he's like, oh, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. And I said, really? You don't know anything? You don't know what's going on there? And he's like, well, I think you'd have to go back hundreds, decades and decades to figure out what happened. And then everyone that mentions anything about it sounds convincing to me. Everyone has good reasons for taking the stance that they do. And there are apparently a lot of Israelis on our island as well. For some reason, there might be some historical connection. I'm not sure. But there are a lot of Israelis in Greece. And so he has talked to some Israelis and he says, well, at the end of the day, I understood where they were coming from, but we both agreed that, like, these are women and children being killed and it needs to stop. So even like my husband, who gets this like basic, he watches the news. He has a basic kind of understanding. This is a really complex phenomenon, but really, like, this is fucked up. It needs to stop. That's it. And then I expressed to him some of my thoughts that I expressed to you yesterday, which I won't say publicly because I need to process.
Yeah.
And see, because he's my litmus test, right? And he looked at me and he was like, no woman or child, at the end of the day, regardless of ideology, is on either side, wants to see their family die before their eyes. And that's like the most basic kind of thing to bring it back to. And you can kind of allow a lot of history and ideology and symbolism to blur. And I hate that I'm going by, like, I'm pulling heartstrings here, but you can allow all of that to blur these basic facts that, at the end of the day, nobody wants to see their family fucking blown up or killed or kidnapped or murdered or whatever. And he said, the Israeli people that he talked to obviously agreed with that. And I think but then, once everybody's agreeing on the basics, you're in the land of ideology. Anyway, I just thought I would say that just from a normie perspective, that is the kind of view that you get, that there is something really horrific happening and you think, oh my God, this needs to stop. And he
Yeah. So would you say that Mika believes that the reason this is happening is because not enough people hold the view that your husband does? That people just don't know about what's going on, and if they did, then it would stop?
No. I think what he said to me was, everybody knows
No.
this.
Do you believe that Mika thinks
Oh, right. I
that
see.
not enough people know what your husband knows?
It's a good question. I don't know. I can't sort of project onto her what she might believe. But if she's saying that the media is not covering it enough, then perhaps she thinks that if it had been given the correct kind of coverage, there would be a critical mass of opposition, that something would happen. I'm not sure. What do you think?
I think that's implied in what Mika says here. And I also eventually want to get to the main point of her video. And the thumbnail shows a picture of her with some universities in the background, like it's protesters in the background and a university campus in the background. And the title on the thumbnail is Profit Over Knowledge. And I think that's worth picking apart a little bit. But the next thing, my next fact check here on her, is that she claims that the reason people hate the humanities is because the state doesn't want citizens to be able to analyze the state and its functions. However, I think those who have been the most critical of the humanities over the past 40 years have been those who claim that critical thinking has been replaced by indoctrination. And so what I would suggest is that rather than being a conscious political project aimed at suppressing dissent, the hatred for the humanities represents dissatisfaction for how the crisis within the humanities has been handled. That David Shield's upcoming book, How We Got Here, provides a fun sketch of this crisis and is a provocation aimed at getting us to think beyond kind of the right, left, red, blue approach to these questions, because the wrestling with how to be critical and how to get at the truth is kind of defines what the humanities are about. And David outlines sort of the strange and distorted and broken walk that we've taken through Western epistemology. So I think that what the right wing, so-called right wing, would want is much more clear, critical thinking, where truth and fact can be easily separated out from fantasies and lies, and the humanities are where those things become problematized, and that's what they object to, not critical thinking itself. What do you think?
Yeah, so what some points that I've written down here, something that I wrote about in my book in relation to the therapeutic university, the transformation of the university into a kind of therapeutic center, where the purpose of education no longer becomes to the extent, I mean, I have to be careful with this because you can say that the purpose of education no longer is blah blah blah, and it kind of implies that there was this ideal time where the university was, just a knowledge center, was committed to a kind of like liberal project. No. But you can kind of compare that against an ideal regardless of whether or not it existed. There was an ideal of a kind of liberal education, and whether or not it existed in the past, there has been a turn to explicitly denigrating that, the pursuit of knowledge as education, or so education as the pursuit of knowledge. That's it. Where this is a very constant refrain that I saw across my research, that universities must no longer be about knowledge, that this was oppressive, and stressful for students, this sort of thing. And there was a switch to a very explicit attempt to redefine the purpose of the university in therapeutic terms. And that's just one way of redefining university. There are also all sorts of other competing claims. So the university has become tasked with solving broader social problems. This is nothing new. As universities expanded, particularly in the 19th century and into the 20th century, they were tasked with solving the problems of broader society, training, becoming a holding center for excess young men, becoming a holding center for young people for which the broader sort of bureaucracy, or for whom the broader bureaucracy and nascent capitalism, growing capitalism at that time didn't have a use for them. This was for whom they didn't have a use. This was what the university kind of has been tasked with, solving these broader kind of social problems, economic problems, that sort of thing. There's nothing new about that. And you have this kind of instrumentalization of the university set up against an ideal of the university as the pursuit of knowledge. So universities kind of as knowledge centers are always on shaky ground, because what's the point of knowledge in capitalist society and neoliberal society? It's always got to be for some purpose. Even the humanities started to redefine themselves in order to survive as problem solvers. We're here to solve all of these broader social problems. So like people say, oh, what's the point of gender studies? What's the point of gender studies? Actually does have a pretty enormous impact within neoliberal capitalism, which wants to break down so-called gender stereotypes with an aim to getting more women into the workplace, and after they have babies, into the workplace as quickly as possible. So you can instrumentalize gender studies. I'm not saying like the actual curriculum is being sort of instrumentalized in this way, but this is sort of like when it gets applied into policy, it gets all garbled into this sort of like men are, duped by stereotypes, and they enact stereotypically masculine roles in the home, and this produces things like domestic violence, broader social problems, and women get stuck in these roles, into these traditional roles, rather than being in the workplace, which is where they really should be. So if we could get men to enact or break down these stereotypes, then they would model good masculine behavior for their children and break down stereotypes in that way. And they would also help more with the childcare and get women back into work as soon as possible. And they were very, I'm thinking the policy framework I have in my mind is the European Union with their gender mainstreaming, where every policy has to kind of think about its impact on gender. And this enormous sort of push to kind of break down gender stereotypes, which is simultaneously a push to get women into often low-paid and precarious work that they wouldn't otherwise take up. And so gender gets weaponized in that way. So there is a purpose to the humanities. There's a purpose to gender. And it's not to question capitalism, but actually in the appearance of questioning capitalism, actually supporting and pushing its newest forms, or perhaps acting as a kind of ideological justification for those pushes. But this instrumentalization of the university means that humanities departments had to recast themselves as useful. And as I mentioned, useful to solving social problems, but also activist, right? So there was a big, just 20 years ago, there was an ongoing debate, maybe more than that, 20, 25 years ago, and it's probably ongoing now. I don't know. It's an anthropology debate within anthropology about whether or not people who study, or ethnographers, people who immerse themselves in different cultures and subcultures and all of that, whether or not they should become advocates or activists for the people and the causes that the people that they study and their causes. And there's this whole there's this big back and forth because, you study these people and they don't really get anything. You get, clout, books, all that stuff, and, cushy positions. But what do they get? And so there's this push to kind of develop activism around things. And generally, people started to see themselves, they started thinking, well, things need to be more politicized. And in general, the university needs to be more politicized, more engaged in the problems that face society. No more of this ivory tower nonsense, right? There was this big sort of you and your ivory tower thing. You need to get stuck into the problems. And again, we've seen this before. This happens in kind of waves. 19th century, there's a similar kind of critique made of the universities, that they need to be more politicized. The students need to be more politicized. And now this is what we have. So this is the humanities trying to justify itself through this politicization. And ironically, through what appears to be a kind of anti-capitalist lens. So it's not like there's the capitalists and the government are like, oh, no, we need to push down the humanities because they're teaching people to be anti-capitalist or whatever. It's the humanities, after already receiving a threat to their own existence, just generally as centers of, the university as a center of the pursuit of knowledge, and humanities being part of that and representative of that, were already being attacked. And they developed politicization as a response to this attack to justify their own existence. Now, it didn't work. Actually, that's not true. If you look at the online rhetoric, it didn't work, where everyone's like, oh, it's the long march to the institutions, that sort of thing. But actually, it has worked, because the people who are most successful at this, they do manage to keep their jobs. And so it has worked for some of those people. But for humanities departments, not so much.
Yeah. Well, it sounds to me like what you're saying, because I think it's worth trying to bring into focus just what kind of activism might be debated in the anthropology departments in the way that you mentioned. I suspect, and maybe you can confirm this for me, that what they were debating was whether or not they should help given minority groups or indigenous groups to advocate for more social services and support. Would that be the kind of thing that they would be asked to participate in as activists and anthropologists?
I'm not entirely sure. As I said, this is the last time that I looked at these debates. It was a long time ago in anthropology. But you can see the kind of development of government initiatives to empower certain groups. For instance, there are very few Indigenous people who get PhDs. But I found enormous encouragement, government programs, that sort of thing, encouragement for me to get a PhD, or for me to go through university. Not that much. I didn't get very much money or anything. I think I got $5,000 once when I was an undergrad, which is no small amount. But there was a lot of encouragement through job opportunities, that kind of thing. And I realized when I was being offered these opportunities that the purpose was for, I'm sure they pictured people a lot less white looking than I am, to administer to the problems of Indigenous people using an Indigenous voice. So drawing people up into the state bureaucracy who are part of those groups that they want to administer to and kind of smooth out relations with. So, I've been massively critical of the direction of policy in Canada in relation to Indigenous people, in spite of the fact that they're just constantly, supposedly celebrating Indigenous people and offering all of these opportunities. I think at its heart, there is a base in a kind of noble savage racism and idea of Indigenous people as victims and that sort of thing. And so you need Indigenous people to come in and like administer to all these victims and give all these social programs that will supposedly rehabilitate the Indigenous victim and make them proper citizens, like embed them in society, smooth out their problems, this sort of thing, and do everything possible besides like give people money and like infrastructure, integrate people into society, because this is a problem as well. Like integration is seen as like colonization, and material development is seen as colonization. Whereas you can go in and psychologically colonize people to the cows come home. That's totally fine. That's giving people back their culture. Anyway, so this is part of what they do as well. It's and it's all done through the language of decolonization. You know, the state is all up in that. They love it. It's all done in this language because it's like, I'm here to save you, but I'm not your white savior. I'm going to do it through this puppet. I'm going to do it through turtles, and I'm going to do it. And then, when I say puppet, I had in mind like an Indigenous person being used as a puppet to for state ideology, but also literally puppets.
Like puppet shows, like bringing in Muppets and things like that.
I think I've talked about this before, that I went to a conference like 12 years ago now. And my jaw was on the floor. And this guy is like, here are these puppets. It's really important to brush your teeth. And oh yeah. And you know, we make sure, because, you know, we can't really trust the parents. You know, the parents, they're a bit iffy, that sort of things. We got to bypass the parents somehow. And they were like, it's really important that you know, learn your Indigenous language in the womb, and that you play with the children. You know, you got to play with it. It's not good enough to just sit at the park. And on your phone, you got to get up on the playground machine. It's like, who the fuck is this puppet supposed to be talking to? But it's literally puppets, this sort of thing. It's like,
listen, my son Noah has sewn together his own puppets, and for a while really thought he might want to be a puppeteer. So like, I am pleased.
Well, to survive, he better become an activist.
I am pleased to hear. Let me get to the end of the thought. I am pleased to hear that there's a jobs program for my son. Now, I want to run a clip from this video that we made yesterday, that I released yesterday. We made like 5 years ago, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about when it comes to the way the university and students are conceived of as political agents, and some of the dangers involved in that. And I think it does relate to the kind of conversations and debates that you were talking about in the anthropology department. Here you go.
During the Enlightenment, the number of public and private schools rose dramatically, and society changed so that even the poor sought access to education. By the 1700s, charity schools teaching various trades began opening in large numbers. The emergence of these kinds of schools at the dawning of the era of capitalism is no coincidence. In England, the enclosure movement a century earlier had pushed peasants off their land and into the cities, where the new working classes and their children worked in slave-like conditions for low wages. The resulting massive poverty brought with it various remedies, including Elizabethan poor laws and charity schools meant to bring both order to the cities and aid to the poor. One of the unintended consequences of the charity schools was that they brought young working-class people together in a highly charged political environment, and often united them with a common purpose. The history of the political aims of student movements mirrors the political history of the development of capitalism. And it goes on, from Russia to Argentina to China to Tokyo to Latin America, West Africa, France, and the United States. As capitalism spread, the inner contradictions and unintended consequences spread as well. Efforts to educate and integrate the young into society came with the risk of heightened political awareness and even radicalization. Still, the political character of these student movements was far from uniform, just as the broader political movements that sprang from the contradictions within capitalism were also variable. Far from being a reliable mechanism for the creation of socialist youths, the student movements historically have been driven both by elite and working class interests, and have included nationalist movements of liberation against foreign powers, anti-Semitic movements associated with Nazism, countercultural movements, as well as socialist movements with radical demands. Student movements have never been entirely independent. The interests of student activists are always tied to the economic and political conditions of their time. And just as the concept of the teenager is a relatively recent cultural development, the notion that students are a homogeneous class of their own, that students have a transhistorical revolutionary potential based on their youth alone, is a relatively new and quite erroneous idea.
So yeah, to go back to what you were talking about before, the idea that anthropology students and I guess professors and researchers should act politically, I think it might presuppose the notion that they would be acting in ways that are independent from capitalism or the society that they're in, that they would not be, that the ways in which they would frame their own activism on behalf of these people wouldn't reproduce the problems that these people are trying to overcome. There's that kind of assumed position, maybe, and I would say that from my suspicion, I don't have any data, but my suspicion would be that most of the ways in which they would try to champion these people would be to also at the same time champion the extension of the progressive administrative state. Would that be wrong?
No, I think that would be right. That's from your video that you posted recently, isn't it? It's a very good video.
Yeah.
What's the title of it so people can go and have a look?
It was posted yesterday. It's a flashback to 2019, a video called "We Live in a Society." That's the series it was a part of, and then the title of the video is "Okay, Boomer, Are Young People the Best Hope for the Left?" And it's about 42 minutes long. I made it, like I said, 2019. So I get all nostalgic when I watch it because my two sons, 2 of the 4 of my kids are in it. That would be Ben and Noah, and they're younger, so they're cuter. Well, especially Noah. But anyhow, yeah, you people should go watch it.
No, it's a great video. And yeah, I think generally there's a tendency to be not nearly critical enough of all of these bureaucratic extensions of the state and the social problems class that it produces. And I remember years ago, actually, after I went to that conference, I was talking to my aunt, who's the one who kind of took me to the conference. It's an initiative that she'd been involved in related to it. And I had asked her, I was kind of like a bit weirded out by the whole thing. And she mentioned to me, how many people make money off of the Indigenous problem. And we had got a settlement. And there's like a lot of bullshit on the right about Indigenous people getting too much. And in fact, we had a troll on one of our comments on one of our videos sort of saying that I was an ethno-nationalist for saying that I was from a particular First Nation. That's where my family is from. I don't know if that makes me a fucking ethno-nationalist, but also that that we get money sometimes. Yeah. Not that much. You become a fucking ward of the state. Woo, that's great. Nobody's like, these people are not like living it up. But my particular reserve had got this pretty big settlement. We just got another one as well. But the reason why we got it is because we it's not like we lost a war or something and like, okay, that's it. We just lay down and take it. No, we had signed treaties. And that's the basis for negotiation now. We had signed treaties. Canadian government did not follow through on the treaty. Okay, you've got all the land, you built some power plants on it, you make a lot of money from these things. That was land that you agreed to give to us. You agreed. We've got the documentation, okay? Anyways, but there was, when we got this settlement, 10 years ago now, there was a big discussion about whether or not it should actually go to Indigenous people. And they were like, well, should it not go to like the community? And what would that actually mean? It would mean sort of administration of social programs, right? To administer to the problems of the Indigenous subject. And who administers these programs? Well, sometimes like the people like I might have become, which is, go and work in the administration of the problems of Indigenous people, which is what I felt that I was kind of being groomed for. I don't know if that's the right word, but prepared for. That's kind of what I was given that money for, the little scholarship that I got. That's what the purpose was. And my aunt had said a lot of people make a lot of money off of Indigenous people. Like, yeah, like there's a whole class of people whose bread and butter it is to live, to administer to the problems of Indigenous people, to do research on Indigenous people. That's their job. To administer social programs when that doesn't work, to develop a new social program, and whatever is the new therapeutic fad, develop that into a program, education, all this stuff to administer to that instead of sort of like, well, it's kind of a wicked issue as well, like integration and infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, when Indigenous people actually get a bunch of money, what they often do, they invest it, they integrate into capitalism. And the reserves that have the fewest social problems are the ones where they've taken their land and built like wineries and engaged in tourism, that sort of thing. We live in capitalist society, right? But people want Indigenous people often to be like this subject that stands apart, right? You can you're like in a zoo. You are untouched. You are pristine. You will stand for everything that we are against. You'll stand against it with us. And when you actually like talk to Indigenous people, they're like pro pipeline because they want jobs, that kind of thing. Yeah, there's like an insufficient. My whole point of that. I think that we're often insufficiently critical of the bureaucratic administrative state because it seems to be stand for the poor, act on its behalf. But there's a wonderful line in Joseph Gusfield's Symbolic Crusade. I think it's Symbolic Crusade. Or no, it's from one of his papers anyway, where he says, like, we live, sociologists, people like me, we live off the problems of others. That's what we do, right? That's usually what a sociologist does, what the humanities do. Not sociologists, not in the humanities, at least not usually. But that's what we do. That's what all of these people do. They live off the problems of others, and they kind of have to. They have to justify their existence. You have to, in order to survive, in order for these departments and universities to survive, they've had to justify their existence. And in increasingly kind of intrusive and misanthropic ways, that you need me, you need my knowledge, because I have access to knowledge that other people don't have, right? Everybody thinks history just progresses. I'm here to tell you it does not. You need my knowledge. And I think to a certain extent, as I said, it's kind of like a necessary thing that's happened within capitalism. But I think people on the left see these people as their allies, or they are those people often, and don't recognize the degree to which this can become so misanthropic, so blaming the person, the individual, the behavior, and offering all these programs to fix the behaviors, fix the individuals, and so on, and how that feeds into a really awful kind of post-liberal destruction of the subject that makes it more and more, I don't know if I want to give too much causative power to it, but makes it more and more difficult to imagine a human subject that is a revolutionary subject without our careful programs and rehabilitation. Don't worry, once we rehabilitate the subject enough, then we will have revolution. I just have to put in another program. I just have to give them more therapy. I just got to teach them Buddhism. I got to teach them how to meditate. That didn't work. I got to raise their self-esteem. Oh no, that didn't work. Something else, forever and ever and ever. We realize, because it is in the language of revolution and radicalism and the other, and decolonization, et cetera, we're insufficiently critical. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
No. I totally agree with everything you're saying. And I want to return to Mika Lefebvre, because I feel as though what you're saying is important for people who like Mika Lefebvre and people who might have watched your video to hear, but to hear it in a particular way. Let me just run that clip of hers again, and then I want to go to my prepared notes for what I have next, and see if we can tie this all together. Here we go.
We are taught about history as a story of humanity's progression through time. With this framework, radical change is discouraged because we are taught that time will heal, and eventually history will absolve the problems of society through the liberal democratic process. But this is simply not the case, and is deeply ahistorical. We got the 8-hour workday largely in part of the Haymarket riots. We got affordable school lunches because of the food programs of the militant Black Panther Party. We are taught that humans learn from our past mistakes and that we're continually seeking to progress ourselves. Yet we are currently witnessing a genocide unfold before our very eyes, and we're seeing media outlets hardly covering it at all. One of the reasons why American society hates the humanities is because the government fears a conscious people who can critically analyze the nation-state and its functions. Now, I don't think this is some grand conspiracy to demonize the humanities. It's simply a product of our oppressive state. It's a product of our market-oriented society. I mean, if you think about it, would the state incentivize someone to take classes that challenge their legitimacy, that challenge their hegemony?
All right. So the last thing she says there, Ashley, about the way in which we aren't taught, but basically the fact that we're not taught about that we're not given the skills in order to critique society adequately, is a product of, she says, the state, and then she says the market, as if they're one. And she's not wrong that they're kind of one, but I think it's important to think about how they are joined and the ways in which they're different. So what she's missing is how, in the United States, at least, a liberal democratic process that she says can't deliver us from evil has been overturned by the progressive state. So she conflates the free market with this permanent bureaucratic state. And this is because of her conception of neoliberalism, I think, and a misunderstanding of just what it was, because I'm going to say was because I think it's behind us now. Neoliberalism was not the opposite of the old welfare state, but the transformation of society based on the welfare state's administration and redistribution of the surplus created by labor on the level of private consumption into an administered society on the level of investment and production as well. It came along.
Could you that is such an important point. Can you rephrase it and like drive it home? Because that is such an important point to make. Sorry, I didn't mean to destroy.
Yeah, it's fine. The welfare state, I mean, it wasn't only one thing even then, but the welfare state was largely aimed at providing a safety net and redistributing the surplus of society so that workers wouldn't starve to death and that they, could survive, right? That's at least how we conceive of it. And neoliberalism was aimed at redistribution of the surplus and the management of finance for the protection of the markets. It was not the liberation of the markets or turning away from controlling the markets, but rather it was an extension of the old Fordist welfare state approach to managing the problems of capitalism.
Yes,
into the realm of the markets, the global market and the domestic markets, both. So
yeah, you manage the market by managing what goes wrong around it, because the market's okay. It's fragile, but it's okay, and you have to manage everybody around it. You have to manage people's behavior, stop making mistakes that lead to problems, crisis and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but okay, as if we think of the 2008 economic crisis as a moment of neoliberalism, which I think we should, then we can see that it also determines winners and losers. It manages the market. So it's not a free market at all. Free market, if I was a strict free market absolutist, I would say those banks should have collapsed. When you don't offer federal financing to restaurants when there's a pandemic. If they shut down, they shut down. So neoliberalism was kind of a welfare program for corporations, and often the most monopolistic corporations. It certainly, on an international level, helped set the table so that the most developed nations would be protected from economic crisis and the periphery would be more likely to suffer. All of this was not, however, just a so-called natural working out of the free market, but rather was the way these contradictions were dealt with, the way society was controlled, administrated, and so forth. So I'm just going to sound like, and I recently had a conversation with Ben Burgess where he accused me of sounding like a libertarian. I'm not saying that this is some sort of conspiracy against the noble entrepreneurial free market capitalists, or that the free market would operate well on its own. Obviously, it wouldn't. right? These things developed out of problems that were in the initial kind of form that capitalism took. But all the ways in which we try to solve the problems of capitalism only deepen our unfreedom, is what I'm going to say. So,
Hmm.
um,
I always feel the need to emphasize that as well, that like when people hear a kind of critique, they assume that you're saying so that should stop. So if you're like you're stepping back and looking at the functions of the welfare state, people think that you're like, oh, we'd be better off without it. No, like it's, it's certainly a lot better to have a safety net than not, right? It's better to have that. There are people who make that argument though, that like, if that it gives the welfare state gives you just enough that you don't revolt, and if you take that away, that somehow people would revolt. But to sort of look back and kind of have a critical perspective on something, it's not saying you're not saying like capitalism would function better without this. No, absolutely not.
right. I don't think it would, but socialists shouldn't confuse the perfecting of the welfare state
Yes,
with the struggle for socialism.
exactly.
And
When I say like it's better to have it than not, I'm not saying I would be out there sitting like that I would be fighting for the expansion of the welfare state over trying to understand the contradictions of capitalism, what comes next. Like that's 100% where I would be. And also because the welfare state functions in these ways that I've just described, which is to, try to create these ideal kind of incapacitated heteronymous subjects. So I feel like I'm plugging my book all the time, but that's like a core kind of thesis in my book. But that it functions in these ways to kind of destroy subjectivity and create a dependent subject. All of that makes it quite bad. But at the same time, as I've said, it's better to have like Social Security than not. But it's not something that I would put at the front of my political program.
right, and socialists
Unless it
shouldn't.
was like, yeah. Anyway, go on.
I don't. I mean, I'm not trying to be prescriptive here much at all, right? But
Yeah.
But to the degree that I would allow myself to be, I would only say that socialists should be attempting to develop a politics where the struggle to hold on to Social Security doesn't define it, and where that struggle can be overcome.
Okay.
And
So
and
you were
not
trying
by
to
deepening the power of the administrative state, but by overcoming it eventually. That's what I think. And maybe this is some sort of anarchism, but I'm not trying to fall on the side of anarchism or in a simple minded way oppose the administrative state, but rather just point to the ways in which it has created conditions which limit our politics and the freedoms that we have. I mean, right now it's very pronounced, the degree to which this permanent bureaucracy is usurping the rights of civil society to try to govern itself. So I wanted to quote from Horkheimer. This is lifted from another video I made a while back about, if you can believe it, David Grush. but I quoted Horkheimer in it. David Grush, the guy who told us about the UFOs that had landed. The end of it, he says, let's see, I'm going to step back a bit. He said, so neoliberalism came along with the undermining of wages and attempt to roll back what are called entitlements. But what it did not do was return us to the 19th century entrepreneurial form of capitalism with its foundation in the so-called free market. The necessity for state regulation and control over the free market should be conceived of as a product of the failure of socialism. Horkheimer said, the individual once conceived of reason exclusively as an instrument of the self. Now he experiences the reverse of this self-deification. The machine has dropped the driver. It is racing blindly into space. At the moment of consummation, reason has become irrational and stultified. The theme of this time is self-preservation, while there is no self to preserve. Merchant and manufacturer alike had to be prepared for all economic and political eventualities. This needs stimulated them to learn what they could from the past and to formulate plans for the future. They had to think for themselves. And then this is my own writing from this other essay. The individual reason of the entrepreneurial individual mediated by the market and commerce, was limited by the demands of the market. But for Horkheimer, this period in the 19th century provided a firmer foundation for the development of socialism than the forms of reason that have developed as capitalism advanced. The strong and sober ego of the acquisitive liberal maintained interests that transcended his immediate needs, whereas the 20th century individual experienced the world as shrinking and was no longer able to use his or her reason to transcend his or her actual position in reality. What changed in bourgeois liberalism was the relationship both capitalists and workers maintained with the state. The entrepreneurial individual was replaced by a conformist cog. We ceased to think for ourselves, but instead thought for and through the state bureaucracy. So that's what I wanted to point out. I'm not claiming, oh well, therefore we should just try to get rid of Social Security, or we just should abandon all programs that might help the most impoverished people get lifted out of poverty. And I certainly wouldn't say, oh yeah, let's get rid of the 8-hour workday or all the other kinds of things that are enforced by the Labor Relations Board or anything like that. I definitely am not making that kind of simple claim, but I am trying to get people to think and help me think about how the advancement of capitalism through the administrative state has put a damper on our own politics and has probably made us dumber in the process.
Yeah, and I think there's a very good comment here from I'm sorry, Burhav. Sorry if I've said this wrong. Do discussions of how to change or stop neoliberalism have an empirical track record of changing or stopping neoliberalism? And I think that this sort of answering this is my way of commenting on what you just said. I don't think you can stop this neoliberal cascade, I guess, of like policies and ideology and that sort of thing. And for anyone who's new here, I don't like the term neoliberal. I like the term post-liberal because even though it's also a problematic term and why I don't use it that often, but I would prefer in an ideal world to call it post-liberal because neoliberal implies it's a kind of rejuvenation of the liberal project to the extent that there was a kind of project during the Enlightenment, that it was this kind of rejuvenation of a strong, rational, autonomous subject or, free trade, this sort of thing. It's the death of that. It's the death of that subject. It's the death of the classical economics that rested on that subject, and it is its death knell in a lot of ways. And a lot of its ideology serves to put that neoliberal subject, put that liberal subject into its coffin. But anyways, it's not about kind of stopping neoliberalism because you can't stop that. Neoliberalism is an expression of stagnant capitalism. That's what it is. It tries to justify. It's a justification of capitalist stagnation. And instead of saying like, well, it speaks to the language of like economic growth, ending economic growth a lot of the time, or like or growth skepticism is probably a more accurate way to put it because it's a bit wishy-washy. It's like sometimes, oh, who cares about economic growth? But then on the other hand, it's, we need this for economic growth, etc. But it tries to kind of justify stagnation as a problem within the self, and the problems of capitalism is essentially psychological problems. So greed will often be denigrated. And I remember that I sat on this panel once trying to get research funding, and one of the people was this fresh, wide-eyed PhD who was like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put out training programs, philosophy, we're going to use philosophy and ethics to sell to businesses training programs for their employees on how to be ethical, because the real problem with capitalism, well, just shouldn't say the C word, but the real problem is that they need to know about ethics, as though like capitalism is just going on and on and on because they're like, oh shit, we had no idea. We had no idea that dumping these chemicals would be bad for the environment. Thank you for your philosophy class. Solved all these problems. But it's it kind of like treats it as though it's a psychological problem that can be solved through behavior management, a huge range of problems. This is the kind of post-liberal policy trajectory that we see in a lot of countries, governments, international organizations. This stuff is everywhere. So it's not about stopping it, but talking about it is at least, I hope, stopping or warning leftists from espousing it themselves, warning them off from espousing it themselves, thinking, because it speaks in the language of socialism a lot of the time, and of the weakest, and diversity, all of that stuff. These are all powerful aspects of contemporary neoliberalism. And if you don't know enough, you think, oh, these people are on my side. That, you know, that's great. Hillary Clinton is my comrade because she's a woman, and that's something capitalism, patriarchy. Now, this is like the neoliberal subject is a female. The neoliberal subject is a girl. And there's a reason why people like Amartya Sen say she all the time when they talk about, you know, when they used to say he, now she says she, he says she. Not because he's trying to be like progressive. Well, on the surface, that's what he is trying to do. But actually, it fits because the neoliberal subject is a self-reflective, uncertain, heteronymous, stereotypical girl. That's what the neoliberal subject is now. Anyways, and so you are kind of, to bring this back, so I'm not trying to stop neoliberalism. I'm trying to tell you, don't be fooled by neoliberalism thinking it's a leftist project. It's not. It's here to justify stagnant capitalism. And just to bring this back around to the capitalist university.
Can I make one point to this? Yeah, neoliberalism has already been stopped. That is not the name of what we're facing. we're
would you agree with my sort of like post-liberal
everything else
idea?
Yeah, post-neoliberal or post-liberal. Yeah, we're facing something that might be called post-neoliberalism. It's hard to say exactly how it's going to shape up. It was too bad there's not a Milton Friedman that can, we can point to and say, here's the theorist of today's, new ideology and new managerial techniques. We don't have that, but we're a lot of the things that we were doing under neoliberalism are being undone right now, and we should take note of that, and that what's happening now ought not to be called neoliberalism, but we also ought not to try to preserve or save it, right? We don't need to try to hold on to the good old days of Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan. That's just an aside. Go ahead.
So to bring this back around to the capitalist university, a lot of what the university does and has been doing really, and it's difficult to kind of treat this as continuous because it may be that these trends kind of pop up for various reasons, different reasons at different times, but nonetheless produce similar results. But part of what the university does is it produces a bunch of bureaucrats, people who will enter into the administrative state. And so the state, to that extent, the state is not afraid of the humanities. The state uses the humanities all the time in ways that I've just described, to justify its position, to kind of give it a wash of progressivism, that sort of thing. But the other thing is that a lot of right-wing people will complain about the feminization of education. In fact, this is something that's even taught in A-level textbooks, the right-wing critique of the feminization of education. And there's a point there, although they're wrong. But they're right that there is something kind of feminized about education now, in that the ideal that at the end of this production line of education, you produce, ideally, an ideal subject. And that subject is feminized because the ideal subject of neoliberalism is, as I said, a girl. And that's not in relation to like the real world of women and girls and all that sort of thing, but the stereotypes associated with it. Things, by the way, that feminists have fought against for, I don't know, at least, I don't know, 80 years or something like that, which is this idea that because you are a woman, you must be, you should be, you are body conscious. So you're health aware, you're risk aware. You are responsible for the moral education of the children. And although that doesn't sound like a very feminine thing, women have always been the sort of guardians of religion. Yes, priests are the ones who stand in the pulpit, but women are the ones who sweep the church, who drag the drunken husband into the church, that sort of thing, stereotypically, right? So women are like these, they're the guardians of morality. They're supposed to be, right? And when you're not that, you get punished big time if you're not that, right? You're doubly deviant because you're transgressing not only morality, but your role as a woman, like following what you're supposed to be. Anyways, You are health conscious, risk aware, constantly second guessing yourself, seeking out someone else to ask advice from. Men are supposedly, they're not. They don't do that. They're too, they're too, they have fragile masculinity, this sort of thing. And they have to they're afraid to ask for help. You're emotive and expressive. You talk a lot. And you can even see this bleeding out into our mental ill health diagnoses, where certain aspects that are associated with masculinity are more likely to be medicalized and problematized, like alexithymia. I'm not saying that anyone's using it as a diagnosis, but that is not talking a lot. It's a masculine kind of trait, and this is medicalized. Even when women are like this, it's medicalized because our culture has an emphasis on that expressiveness. So neoliberalism wants that expressiveness because nothing can stay hidden. You got to put it all out there. You got to put it all out there so that it can be put onto a script. I wrote about this for Unheard, I don't know, a month ago. Your boss doesn't care about your feelings, obviously. But if you look through the documents of, I give a few examples in the article of, what was the one I'm thinking of? Bupa. They're express. Step 1, express the emotion, right? Talk. Step 3 and 4 are treatment. Getting people onto the right script. Express the negative emotion, the bad thing, and then treat it. You have to get it onto the right script, make the right feeling. So if you're not expressing the negative feelings about your work, for instance, you can stay inside, you can bubble up, can become something worse. You can go on strike. You might go off sick. We don't want that. That's bad for the bottom line. So you express it so that the boss is aware of it and can bring that back onto a script. So that's the ideal subject. And yes, education to a certain extent has developed to emphasize that and to place a lot of importance on that kind of risk awareness. Tons of this, a ton of education is being aware of all these different risks: health awareness, self-awareness, body image, body consciousness, expressiveness, emotiveness, the move toward therapeutic education. All of this is part of the capitalist university. What's interesting, though, is that as we think that, as we're constantly railing against things that have been dead for 50, 60 years, we think of this as progressive, as, yes, it's a movement within education to fight against what capitalist education was all about. Capitalist education was about rote learning. It was about being at the end of an assembly line and just parroting out the things. But the funny thing is, critique itself has become freaking rote learning. You learn exactly how the critique you're supposed to give. All my sociology students will give you the exact same critique about eating disorders and advertising and social media. They will all say the exact same things. They're all passionate about mental health. Sorry, students, I feel bad for saying this. It's not your fault. It's just, this is kind of what we teach you. We teach you critique by rote. Okay, so but this is what comes out at the end of education, and it is not against what capitalist education was. It's not a magical movement to throw capitalism under the bus from the inside. It is on the bus of post-liberal capitalism. And we should go to the parrot room now. We should.
Yeah, we should. I wanted to conclude this stream by reading something from Joshua Courier's recent article for Sublation. And I'm going to provide a link to this article in the description after we close out. But it's just about it. It may not seem really relevant to everything that's been said, but if people take it up and think about it, there might be a connection. And here it is. For us to better understand the left and right as relative concepts, we need something less abstract and more concrete, he says. Kolakowski defines the left as being driven by the desire to negate existing reality, in contrast to the right, which seeks to affirm existing reality. Because the left desires something new, because it wants to expand possibilities for freedom beyond current necessities, it must hold true to its ideals despite their present unreality. This leads the right to accuse the left of being liars and utopians, because the left always stands for something that is, at present, untrue. The left is therefore ideological, or to put it in more charitable terms, principled, in a way that the right is not. Whereas the left is challenged to envision a new society, the right uses whatever tactics it needs to preserve the status quo. The politics of left and right are thus reducible to a difference between principles and opportunism. The right is better at politics because it is less restricted by the need to change things in pursuit of some principled aim. This allows the right to frame present reality as being far superior to anything the left desires, since its only conviction is that we live or have lived in the best of all possible worlds. The left, in response, can only raise the uncomfortable question posed by Voltaire's Candide. If this is the best of all possible worlds, what then are the others? So there's more to that article. I want to put a link to it, but I would say, just to try to clarify before we end, why I put that there, beyond the fact that I wanted to get people to look at Sublation Magazine, was that all too often the left today tries to find aspects of what is what we have that they can champion, rather than trying to think through to what could become. So, rather than bashing liberal democracy for not delivering on its promises, we should try to think through why that hasn't happened, rather than championing the welfare state for at least providing us some measure of survival. We should ask, why are we merely surviving in this world? And that's where I want to end the stream. And we'll talk a little bit about Gaza maybe in the Parrot Room, maybe not a lot, because there's a lot to process and we have to do it next week. But yeah, see you in the Parrot Room. There's a link in the description. I'll put it as a comment and pin that to the top, and we'll close this up.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,